I'm Scott Allen Miller, and welcome to another episode of Literary Gaming. Today I'm going to talk about the game I just completed this last night with my daughters, the Painscreek Killings. I find this game really interesting because they did some things that are just different and they did them in a good way. So the foundation of this is an adventure game where you are attempting to unravel a series of mysteries that has happened in a small town a number of years ago over a large period of time. You're a reporter. You have been brought into this town because your paper or editor or whatever was interested in a story, and so your job is to go into this town where it is now a ghost town. There's nobody living there. The entire town has become vacant. And use what is left in the town from some information you have ahead of time to going through empty buildings and slowly piecing together a series of events that happened over a long period of time. And so you're kind of an investigative reporter, and the whole game is built as a walking simulator. So it's very quiet. You have lots of time. You have no schedules on anything. You can just take your time and slowly walk around town and discover things a little bit at a time. It uses some traditional game mechanics that are common in adventure games where, for example, you will need to go to one location, find a key that will allow you to go to another location, or you find another key, and so on and so forth, giving somewhat of a feel of being open world while being relatively linear in its storytelling. There is quite a bit of latitude for going to different buildings or different parts of town, finding clues in different orders and so forth. But by and large, you're going to be directed through the story with a certain amount of narrative. So this is not a huge amount of interactive storytelling. It's more of an interactive device that allows you to move the story forward. But I thought that the game was overall well done in that it told a relatively deep story. It used very comfortable game mechanics that did a good job at allowing it to do storytelling. For the most part, it is all through reading diary entries, sometimes finding newspaper articles, once in a while reading a police report, for example. You don't interact with characters. There's no characters in the game. You don't watch videos. You don't listen to voice actors. Once in a very great while, you may have something recorded on a cassette tape to listen to, kind of thing, but it's very little. Almost entirely, you're looking at diary entries. So this made the game much easier to make with a small studio. I have no idea how big their team is, but EQ Studios, who made it, this was their first game, and certainly it was a smaller game in many ways, right? This is a good example of something that at least a small team could have made. I don't know the size of the team in reality, and how a team that isn't that large could, in theory, try some different types of storytelling. And in this case, I think it did a very good job of making you engaged in the story and making you really want to know what happened to different characters and when. It was very good at making you care about the characters. You, over time, became very concerned about finding the right person and wondering what had led people to the events that ended up happening. And so I think, in general, it was very good. Our overall assessment with it was we were very happy. There are some notes with this that are kind of odd for this type of game. Because it was a walking simulator, generally you assume that there's going to be absolutely no jarring interactions. You expect it to be really very similar to if you just had a simulator of sitting at a desk and you're just looking through papers, and it's like looking at a picture, looking at it, whatever, and you will eventually piece together a story. That is how this essentially plays out. There are some creepy locations, mostly because these are abandoned buildings, but they're not specifically creepy. You don't have weird things happening. You don't have weird sounds, anything like that. You just have dimly lit buildings that have not been occupied for several years, and that's naturally creepy to some degree. And that you have an entire village that is empty completely of people with empty cars sitting on the side of the road. That stuff is weird because it really looks like basically everyone just packed up and ran away. That's inherently creepy as well. But when you put it all together, it should be relatively low key. However, once in a while, and this is just the tiniest bit of a spoiler, but it really is minor, there is a couple times that you see something just for a moment in the distance that is not consistent with the walking simulator, and those things make for an air of creepiness that My daughters found enough that they would not have played the game without me. They really needed me to play it because they're like, we're just waiting for something more dramatic to happen. And it doesn't really happen. But the fact that it went just a little bit beyond being a pure walking simulator with no all other character interaction, that it created a fear of more happening, even though it didn't. That said, coming to the end of the game, and this is a little bit of a spoiler, so if you're not interested in the spoiler, skip over this bit. The end, I'm going to do my best not to give away any story. At the end of the game, there is a sudden jarring change of type of game, and it stops being a walking simulator. And for the last 2 minutes or so of the game, you're in an adventure game, an action adventure game, where you really have to move very quickly and make decisions very rapidly. You do have some opportunity to play it again. It's not like you lose the game if you suddenly are caught off guard, but the game's style changes dramatically in the last moments. This is not an uncommon thing. We see the same thing in Nancy Drew games, for example. Generally, this type of change of game style is a big negative. It would be similar to if you were reading a novel at home, traditional literature. You got to the last page, and as you're reading the last page, you notice that the protagonist or the antagonist of the story was suddenly becoming very agitated and reacting to the fact that you were reading the book. And as you got to the end of the book, you suddenly heard someone kick down your door and start chasing you. And it was the character from the book, and it went from just casually reading a story to you being a character in the story being chased. That's a really weird and terrifying thing to have happen, and that's the kind of feeling you get from the end of this game, that the thing that a lot of people would enjoy about playing this game for, say, 10 or 12 hours suddenly changes, and the style of the game is dramatically different at the very last few minutes. Now, on one hand, this last-minute change of game style could be seen as traditionally jarring and breaking the generally accepted rules of game design. You don't want to change game play partway through a game, and lots of games do, and it's often seen as a kludge. It is a way to help move along a story that maybe they were stuck on, or they tried to simplify something from a game design or a game mechanics perspective to move things along. Very famously, like Nancy Drew, you spend the entire game doing an inventory control puzzle mechanism with that's story driven, and suddenly to get to the very end of the game, you may have a chase sequence, or someone is racing you on a snowmobile, and you have to suddenly be in an action game when up until that moment you were in a story driven game that was point and click, and your skills that you've learned and your controls that you've learned are different, and it takes you out of the gaming experience in many cases. It makes you feel like you're somewhere else. I remember first experiencing that type of thing when playing the Black Cauldron, which was part of the King's Quest family of games from Sierra back in the 1980s. The entire game was this very standard point and click. You walk from scene to scene, you collect things in your inventory, and at one point you have to climb a castle wall as people drop rocks on you, and it's like an arcade sequence in the middle of a game that never uses those skills before or after, and it was very jarring. It wasn't impossible to do, but it was a physical challenge in the middle of a game that you thought you were playing with a different goal in mind. So it's often seen as a very big negative to do this. However, in the Painscreek killings, it is easy to argue that this was a very useful technique for taking a story that changed from being one of discovery and one of narrative into one where they really were looking to suddenly induce panic, to give you adrenaline all of a sudden and make you see the interactions of the characters as very different than you had up until that point. And so it is a good argument that you can use this type of jarring experience to incite a completely different emotional reaction from the narrative storyteller, from the game player themselves, in a way that they can't really escape. They're stuck having to face that change, that jarring moment, and their emotional reaction to it becomes part of their view of the story. I think from the reactions of people that I read, in general, people are not in favor of this, and it was not something that people liked that much, but the developers jumped in, and I saw some discussions with them where they're like, we played test this with a lot of people, and we got some really good feedback that people really enjoyed this new pressure, this emotional moment at the end of the game, and that it gave them more of a satisfaction with completing it. It made it more of a complete experience. Maybe it gave them closure in a way that other potential endings would not have done. And so I think with the Painscreek killings, you have a great example of where this is a useful tool, but it's also an extreme example of making a design choice that would be generally unpopular or on paper wouldn't make sense. I think our personal, this is me and my daughter's take on it, is that we did not really like that ending, but I absolutely respect why I think they decided to do it, and it certainly has a narrative purpose, and that would be, I think, the most important argument that you could make, other than simply enjoyability. But I do think that it served the narrative in a bizarre kind of way, but it worked to some degree at least. Certainly for me, I am specifically very opposed to the jarring change of game style. I really never want to play a game where I learn the skills, I put in the time, I invest in the game, and then at some point the game becomes a different game, and I have to potentially get stuck and give up on the game or whatever. This particular moment did not create a situation where you would necessarily become stuck, even if you were unable to handle the change of gameplay. So that, kudos to them for that design decision. But it did make the ability to get to the 100%, to really just go all in on the game and become completely invested in it, was more difficult. Not impossible, and they did not make it a insurmountable task or something that most gamers would find to be particularly challenging. Maybe a little bit of work, but not terrible. But there are people who choose games like this because they're able to play at a certain pace, so they're able to handle different types of things. And so this game starts off as a game where someone who's not able to play an action game would have no problem. They could do anything in the game, no problem. If someone finds jump scares or high intensity games to be a problem, not an issue. They could do this game because knowing that there's nothing like that. But because of this jarring moment at the end, it eliminates a lot of the audience. People who may have been just fine with the majority of the game, suddenly the end of it could present a bit of a problem for them. And that's a reason why, in general, you want to avoid those types of things. But it was such a neat narrative tactic. We did find it very interesting, and all of us agreed that it did have some benefits. We think we would have leaned away from it as a design decision on our own. But one of the great things about games like this is I spent a lot of time with my daughters, who are 12 and 15 at this point, discussing that design decision. Did it make sense? Did we appreciate it? What were its benefits? What was its merits? What was its demerits? What were the things that made it negative? Why? Who did it affect? Did it serve a narrative purpose and all that? Those are things that we delve into, and that's one of the things that we love so much about interactive gaming in general, the whole literary gaming experience, is that it causes us to have real conversations. Sometimes about the story, sometimes about the storytelling, but that is exactly what we expect from a good book as well. And so another great example, I think, of how video games can be a part of the literary experience in a way that quite often books would struggle to do. You would never find a book that was able to trigger this kind of interactive and change of media at the last moment to elicit a different response. And so this is an exploration of where games offer us more storytelling capabilities than other media. Thanks for joining me. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so by buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. And of course, like and subscribe. That will do a lot to help with the channel. If you're interested in my daily vlog, which is mostly about my life living in Central America, where I moved with my family 3 years ago, you can check that out here on YouTube at youtube.com/Scott Allen Miller vlog. It is a completely different format than this, and you may enjoy that as well. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you in the next adventure.